The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not an absence of sound, but a change in its texture. The low, familiar hum of the server rack in Victor's home office, a sound I had long ago tuned out, suddenly felt predatory. It was the only thing moving in a room that had gone perfectly still. My own breathing had stopped. In my hand, I held a manila folder, cool and smooth against my skin. The label, printed from his machine in a neat sans serif font, read, "Assets Split." My name is Renee. I am 35 years old, and for the last 10 years, I have been an interior designer and a wife. The two roles were, for a long time, indistinguishable. I design spaces, I take empty rooms with good bones but no soul, and I give them a story. I layer textures, balance light, and create flow so that a person can walk into a house and feel, instantly, that they are home. I believe that the spaces we inhabit shape us, that a room can hold a memory, and that a home is the most honest autobiography a person can write. For a decade, my husband, Victor, was the protagonist of the story I was writing with our life. He was 42 when we met, 38 now, a man who moved through the world with the unflappable confidence of someone who had never once had to check the price of anything on a menu. He confused control with preparedness, believing that if he could anticipate every outcome, he could inoculate himself against disappointment. He built spreadsheets for vacations and flowcharts for arguments. He saw life as a project to be managed, and for a long time, I saw his meticulous planning as a form of care. I mistook his management of our life for investment in it. I had forgotten that the most beautiful rooms are the ones with space to breathe, the ones that allow for the unexpected grace of a sunbeam hitting a dusty corner just so. I had built him a perfect house, and he had mistaken it for a fortress. The folder in my hand was one of 3, sitting in a neat stack on the corner of his polished mahogany desk, partially obscured by a stack of financial reports. I had come in looking for a warranty document for the dishwasher, an appliance I had spent 3 weeks researching. He had been on a conference call in the living room, his voice a low, authoritative murmur that had become the background music of our home. I saw the folders by chance, their stark white labels turned toward me like accusations. Assets, split, timeline, and the last one, the one that made the air crystallize in my lungs. Renee, move out. It would be 6 months before he knew I'd seen them. 6 months before our final, sterile conversation in the cavernous shell of the living room I had designed. 6 months before he would look at me, his face a mask of aggrieved confusion, and deliver the line that was meant to be his final clean cut. The line that proved he had never understood the story of us at all. "This is all so dramatic, Renee," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "I was going to serve you next week. Clean and simple. Clean and simple, like closing a bank account, like terminating a contract." He spoke of ending our marriage with the same dispassionate efficiency he used to describe a corporate merger. The cruelty wasn't in the act itself, but in the language he used to describe it. It revealed that he saw our shared life not as a living, breathing thing, but as a portfolio of assets to be liquidated. He hadn't just been planning to leave me, he had been planning to manage my departure. The folder in his office wasn't a desperate measure, it was a project plan. I was a line item in the budget of his new life. And in that moment, standing in the living room he thought he owned, surrounded by the ghosts of furniture I had already moved, I felt a profound and quiet pity for him. He had spent so much time planning the demolition, he never once noticed the foundation had already been removed. The archaeology of our marriage began with the house. It was a classic Chicago brownstone in Lincoln Park, a beautiful 4-story structure with elegant bones and a century of neglect clinging to its walls. We bought it 3 years into our marriage, a purchase Victor called our forever investment. For him, it was a symbol of his arrival, a physical manifestation of his success in the logistics industry. For me, it was a canvas. I saw past the water-stained plaster and the floors that sighed under every footstep. I saw the way the afternoon light poured through the tall parlor windows, the intricate original millwork hiding under layers of yellowed paint, the potential for a home that felt both grand and intimate. For 2 years, that house became my entire world. Victor was busy, his company expanding, so the renovation fell to me. I wasn't just the designer, I was the architect of our domestic life. I was the project manager, the general contractor, the vendor liaison, and the therapist for every tradesperson who walked through the door. I spent my days on dusty job sites, negotiating with plumbers who tried to talk down to me and electricians who quoted Victor a different price than they quoted me. I learned to read blueprints with the fluency of a second language. I spent my nights creating mood boards, sourcing reclaimed hardwood from a barn in Wisconsin, and tracking down the perfect slabs of Calicut marble for the kitchen island. I remember one night, sitting on the floor of what would be our living room, surrounded by dozens of paint swatches. It was nearly midnight. The single work lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the exposed lath and plaster. Victor came home late, smelling of expensive steak and the city's cold air. He stood in the doorway, his briefcase still in hand, and surveyed the chaos. "Still playing with colors, babe?" he asked, a tired smile on his face. "Playing." The word landed like a small, smooth stone in my gut. I had just spent 10 hours arguing with a structural engineer about a load-bearing wall, but to him, my work was play. It was my passion project, a charming hobby that kept me occupied while he did the real work of earning a living. He never saw the spreadsheets I maintained, the budget I meticulously managed, the Gantt charts I used to coordinate the demolition crew with the framers. He just saw the beautiful, finished product and assumed it had appeared effortlessly from my imagination. This was the nature of my invisible labor. I was the infrastructure of his comfort. The house was just the most visible part of it. The erosion was gradual, a slow sanding away of my contributions until they were so smooth he no longer noticed them. It was in the client dinners I hosted twice a month. Victor believed his success was forged in boardrooms, but I knew that some of his biggest contracts were secured over the coq au vin I'd spent 2 days preparing. I curated every detail of those evenings. I designed the tablescape to feel welcoming but impressive. I researched his clients, learning about their wives, their hobbies, their alma maters, so I could steer the conversation into comfortable waters. I remembered who was gluten-free and who only drank single malt scotch. I created an atmosphere of effortless elegance, a stage on which Victor could perform as the brilliant, successful man of the house. After the guests would leave, giddy with wine and the warmth of our home, he would kiss my forehead and say, "You're the best hostess, Renee. They loved you." He never said, "Thank you for helping me secure that 7-figure deal." He saw my contribution as social, not strategic. It was charm, not work. The permission structure for this slow erasure came from his best friend, Elliot. Elliot was a man who spoke about marriage and relationships with the cynical jargon of a hedge fund manager. He talked about emotional overhead, hedging your bets, and minimizing your exposure. I met him only a few times, but his voice began to echo in our home. Victor would come back from a drink with Elliot and use his phrases. One evening, I was upset about a fight with my sister. I was telling Victor about it, my voice thick with emotion. He listened, but his gaze was distant. "You know," he said, swirling the ice in his glass, "Elliot says you have to get ahead of these things. You can't let someone else's emotional state dictate your own narrative." His own narrative. It was such a cold, foreign phrase. I wasn't asking him to solve my problem. I was asking him to share my sadness. But he was processing my pain as a logistical issue to be managed, a variable to be controlled. Elliot had given him a language for his own emotional detachment, dressing it up as savvy preparedness. I started to notice it everywhere. When we'd argue, he'd accuse me of being unproductive. When I'd try to talk about our future, he'd say we needed to table that for a more strategic discussion. He was applying the principles of supply chain management to our intimacy. Love, to Victor, was becoming another system to be optimized for maximum efficiency and minimum disruption. The most painful part of this archaeology was sifting through the contaminated memories. The day the renovation was finally complete, we threw a party. Our friends and family wandered through the rooms, their voices filled with awe. The house was beautiful. It was a perfect blend of modern comfort and historic character. Every corner, every fixture, every piece of furniture was something I had personally chosen, fought for, and placed. That night, Victor stood in the center of the living room, a glass of champagne in his hand, and made a toast. "To my brilliant wife, Renee," he said, beaming at me, "and to our perfect home, a place we can build our future." At the time, my heart swelled with pride. I felt seen. I felt loved. But looking back now, through the lens of those 3 manila folders, I hear his words differently. He toasted me, and then he toasted the house, as if we were 2 separate, though equally valuable, assets. He wasn't celebrating the life we had built. He was celebrating the completion of a project. He loved the house for what it represented, a stable, high-value asset. He loved me for my ability to produce it. When my production was no longer required, my role became obsolete. The home was finished. The project was complete. It was time, as Elliot would say, to get ahead of the next phase. The discovery happened on a Tuesday in April. The sky outside was the color of slate, a classic Chicago spring day threatening a rain that never quite came. Victor was on a 2-day trip to Minneapolis, a last-minute thing. I was using the quiet to catch up on paperwork, specifically to find the capital gains documentation from the sale of my old condo, the one I sold to help fund the brownstone renovation. I knew the files were in his office, in the large filing cabinet where he kept all our official documents. His office, like the rest of the house, was a room I had designed. It was meant to feel like a sanctuary, walls the color of a stormy sea, custom-built walnut shelves, a soft wool rug to absorb sound. I wanted it to be a place of calm focus. But as I slid open the heavy drawer labeled Financials, a different feeling settled over me. A cold, quiet dread. I found my condo sale folder easily enough, but as I went to slide the drawer shut, my eyes caught on 3 folders tucked at the very back, behind everything else. They were newer than the others, the manila crisp, the labels freshly printed. They weren't filed alphabetically like everything else. They were hidden. My hand hesitated over them. It felt like a violation, a trespass into a part of his life I wasn't meant to see, but the names on the labels were a summons I couldn't ignore. Assets. Split. Timeline. Renee move out. I pulled the first one out. My hands were perfectly steady. As an interior designer, I am trained to see the structure beneath the surface. I can look at a wall and know what's behind it, The studs, the wiring, the plumbing. I understand that what you see is only a fraction of the story. Opening that folder felt like opening up a wall in my own marriage and finding nothing but rot. It was a spreadsheet, a meticulously organized list of everything we owned, from the brownstone itself down to the sterling silver flatware my grandmother had given us. Next to each item were 2 columns, V and R. He had already divided our life. The house was his. My car, which he'd always called a frivolous purchase, was mine. The art in the hallway, pieces I had sourced from a gallery in Pilsen, he had allocated to himself. The small business I had built, my design firm, he had marked with a question mark, followed by a note. Valuation needed, Elliott connection. He was planning to assess my life's work as a marital asset to be divided. I placed the spreadsheet back on the stack of papers inside and picked up the second folder. Timeline. This one was a calendar printout of the next 3 months. Key dates were circled in red. May 15th, meet with counsel. June 1st, serve papers. June 20th, initial hearing. He had a schedule for dismantling our marriage, plotted out with the same precision he used for a product launch. There were notes in the margins, reminders to himself. Secure new accounts. Change passwords. Inform family. Coordinated message. He wasn't just planning a divorce, he was planning a campaign. My heart wasn't pounding. My eyes weren't filling with tears. Instead, a profound and unnerving stillness settled over me. It was the feeling I get when I walk into a client's disastrous, chaotic space for the first time. The moment before I begin to design, before I see the solutions, there is a single, silent beat of pure observation. I see the clutter, the bad lighting, the awkward flow, and I don't feel anger or despair. I feel clarity. The problem presents itself in its totality, and in that moment, I know exactly what must be done. I opened the third folder. Renee, move out. It was the thinnest of the 3, but the most brutal. It contained a list of moving companies with their quotes circled, a printout of available 1-bedroom apartment listings in neighborhoods he considered suitable for me. There was even a checklist: forward mail, disconnect utilities, return keys. He had planned my entire exit without me. He had curated my new life, chosen my new neighborhood, and budgeted for my displacement. He had taken the most intimate and painful moment of a person's life and turned it into a logistical exercise. He wasn't ending a relationship. He was managing an inventory item that was no longer needed. I carefully placed the folders back exactly as I had found them, tucked behind the others, hidden in the dark. I slid the drawer shut. The click of the mechanism was the only sound in the office. It was the sound of a lock turning, of a decision being made. He thought he was the one with the plan. He thought he was the one in control. He had no idea that in that moment, standing in the silent sea blue office I had created for him, I had just drafted a new design, a design for a life he would have no part in. The project wasn't his to manage anymore. It was mine. The 6 months that followed were a master class in performance. On the surface, nothing changed. I was still Renee, the attentive wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who made sure our home ran with the silent, seamless efficiency of a luxury hotel. I still asked Victor about his day. I still cooked the meals he loved. I still laughed at his jokes. But inside, I was an architect drawing up plans for a new construction. My warmth was a temporary facade, scaffolding that would be taken down once the real work was done. My first move was to find a space of my own. Victor's research into suitable 1-bedrooms was an insult, a paternalistic gesture designed to manage my dissent. He imagined me in a sterile high-rise in Streeterville, a place for someone starting over, someone diminished. I did the opposite. I found a garden-level apartment in a vintage brick building in Wicker Park, a neighborhood humming with a creative energy that Lincoln Park had long since traded for quiet wealth. It was smaller than our brownstone, of course, but the space was intelligent. It had character. Tall windows looked out onto a shared courtyard filled with overgrown hydrangeas, and the afternoon light was magnificent. It was a space that didn't need to be grand to feel whole. I signed the lease under my business name, telling the landlord it was a satellite office and client meeting space. I paid the deposit and first month's rent from a new bank account I'd opened, funded by the steady, quiet income from my design firm, an income Victor had always referred to as my little bit of pocket money. My preparation was methodical, a quiet deinstallation of myself from the life we had shared. I began to move things, piece by piece, with the stealth of a thief. Not the big things, not yet. I started with the soul of the house, the small, irreplaceable objects that held my story, the collection of antique ceramic bowls I'd found at a flea market in Paris, the first edition copy of a novel my father had given me, the hand-thrown vase that was the first piece I ever bought for myself as a professional designer. Victor never noticed they were gone. His eyes scanned rooms for their overall impression, their monetary value. He didn't see the details. The details were my domain. I became a forensic accountant of our marriage. I spent late nights in my own office, not his, poring over bank statements and credit card bills, tracing the flow of our shared finances. I documented every penny I had contributed, every invoice from my firm that had been deposited into our joint account to cover a shortfall, every time I had paid for a shared expense on my own. I was building a case, not for a courtroom, but for my own peace of mind. I needed to see, in black and white, the architecture of his entitlement. The irony was excruciating. As Victor moved closer to his own D-Day, his own scheduled ambush, he became more relaxed, almost affectionate. His secret plan gave him a sense of security. He believed he was in control of the narrative, and it made him magnanimous. He would bring me flowers, compliment my cooking, suggest a weekend trip. Each gesture of kindness was a fresh wound. He was being generous with the woman he was about to discard. He was watering a plant he had already uprooted. One night, about a month before his planned service, we were having dinner. He was telling me about a difficult negotiation at work. "It was tough," he said, swirling his wine. "But you have to be 10 steps ahead. You have to control the process from start to finish. If you let the other party set the terms, you've already lost." He was talking about a shipping contract, but I heard him talking about us. He looked at me, a self-satisfied smile on his face. Elliot always says, the best surprise is no surprise. You have to be the one holding the timeline. I just nodded, taking a slow sip of my own wine. I held his gaze over the rim of my glass. "That's very smart, Victor," I said, my voice even. He had no idea I was holding a timeline of my own. He was planning a clean, simple amputation. He didn't know I was a surgeon who had already completed a quiet, precise extraction, leaving behind nothing but a hollow shell. My preparation wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. I was reclaiming my finances, my possessions, my future. I was taking back the story, sentence by sentence, until the book of our life together contained nothing but blank pages. He could have the empty binding. I was keeping the words. The exit was scheduled for a Wednesday in early October. Victor was on a 3-day business trip to San Francisco, a trip he'd been planning for months. The day before he left, He was particularly solicitous, kissing me goodbye at the door with a performance of affection that felt both cloying and pathetic. "I'll miss you," he said, holding my face in his hands. "Hold down the fort." I smiled and promised I would. The fort, as he called it, was about to be peacefully decommissioned. At 8 a.m. on Wednesday, the moving truck arrived. It wasn't one of the companies from Victor's list. It was a small independent crew I had worked with on design projects for years. They were discreet, efficient, and loyal. I stood on the front steps of the brownstone, a clipboard in my hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, and directed the operation with the calm authority of a site foreman. The temperature of the day was cool and precise, just like my emotions. There was no rage, no frantic sorrow. The grief for my marriage had been processed over the past 6 months, in the quiet solitude of my new apartment, in the meticulous lines of my spreadsheets. Today was not about emotion, it was about logistics. We started with the living room, the custom-made sofa, the one with the perfect shade of velvet I had spent weeks sourcing. The mid-century armchairs I had found at an estate sale and had lovingly restored. The enormous abstract painting that hung over the fireplace, a piece from a young Chicago artist I was championing. As each piece was carefully wrapped and carried out, the room began to exhale. Its personality, my personality, was being systematically removed. The acoustics changed. Without the soft furnishings to absorb it, sound began to bounce off the bare walls, creating a hollow, lonely echo. We moved through the house, room by room. The dining room table where I had hosted his clients, the antique Persian rug from the master bedroom, the carefully curated collection of art books from the library shelves. I took my clothes, my shoes, my personal effects. I left his. His suits hung in the closet, a silent army awaiting a general who would never return to that command post. His expensive watches sat in their velvet-lined box on his dresser. His golf clubs stood by the back door. I left every gift he had ever given me, from the diamond earrings to the designer handbag. They were not part of my story. They were props in his. By 3 p.m., the truck was loaded. My crew chief, a kind man named Marcus, did a final walkthrough with me. "That's everything on the list, Renee," he said, his voice gentle. "Are you sure?" I stood in the doorway of the living room and surveyed the scene. It was no longer a home. It was a collection of walls and floors and windows. It was an architectural shell, stripped of all warmth and life. It looked like a high-end rental property between tenants. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the empty air. It was stark. It was cavernous. It was perfect. The symbol of my departure was not something I left behind, but the absence I created. Victor thought he owned the house. He was wrong. He owned the deed, the mortgage, the property tax bill. I had owned its soul, and I was taking it with me. I thanked Marcus and his team, and as their truck pulled away from the curb, I took one last walk through the empty rooms. I ran my hand along the cool marble of the kitchen island where I had prepped 1,000 meals. I stood in the bedroom where I had woken up every morning for 7 years. I felt a pang, not of regret, but of a quiet, mournful nostalgia for the woman I had been when I first walked into this house, full of hope and a belief in shared futures. She was a good woman. She had deserved better. I walked out the front door, locking it behind me for the last time. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a ring on a counter. My silence and the vast, echoing emptiness of the house he thought was his greatest asset would be my only statement. I had not fled. I had simply finished. The project was complete. The installation was over. It was time to move on to the next design. Victor's discovery began not with a bang, but with a text message. He landed at O'Hare on Thursday evening and sent his usual arrival text. Landed. Grabbing a car. See you soon. I didn't reply. An hour later, my phone buzzed again. Home. Where are you? Then, a minute later, what the hell? Where is the sofa? The escalation cascade had begun. I was at my new apartment, sitting on my newly delivered velvet sofa, a glass of wine in my hand. The room was filled with the warm, comforting scent of boxes and new beginnings. I read his texts and felt a distant, clinical sense of observation. The first stage was shock and denial. A flurry of texts and missed calls. Renee, this isn't funny. Did we get robbed? Call me now. The TV is here, but the chairs are gone. What is happening? He couldn't process the scene. The selective nature of the emptiness was a puzzle his logical mind couldn't solve. A robbery was random, chaotic. This was precise. This was surgical. I let his calls go to voicemail. His messages grew more frantic, his voice tight with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into anger. This was the second stage, accusation. When he finally realized this was not a prank or a crime, but an action I had taken, his tone shifted. What the hell is wrong with you, Renee? He yelled into my voicemail. This is the most childish, dramatic, manipulative thing I have ever seen. You could have just talked to me. You owe me an explanation. He believed he was owed something. Even now, standing in the wreckage of our home, his primary concern was the violation of protocol. I had not followed the rules. The third stage was recruiting allies. He called my mother, who after a long, calm conversation with me the day before, simply told him, "Victor, I think you need to speak with your wife," and hung up. He called our mutual friends, trying to paint me as unhinged, spinning a story of his shock and concern, but my closest friends already knew. My best friend, Sarah, had been my silent partner in this for months. When Victor called her, she listened patiently to his tirade and then said simply, "She's fine, Victor. You should worry about yourself." By Saturday, he had located me. He likely hired someone, or perhaps just used a locator app on our shared phone plan. He showed up at my new apartment building, buzzing the intercom relentlessly. I didn't answer. He waited in his car for hours. This was the fourth stage, negotiation and false remorse. His text softened. "Renee, please, let's just talk. I know I haven't been perfect. We can fix this. Whatever this is, we are better than this." He was offering compromises he never would have considered when he held all the cards. He was offering to fix a structure he had already scheduled for demolition. It was the desperate bargaining of a man who had lost control of the timeline. I finally agreed to see him, not in my new home, that space was sacred, but back at the brownstone. The empty house felt like neutral territory, a monument to what was already gone. When I walked in, he was standing in the middle of the living room, looking small and lost in the vast emptiness. He started immediately, his voice strained. "This is insane, completely over the top." "Is it?" I asked, my voice quiet. It didn't echo. It landed solidly in the space between us. "Yes, this whole production." He gestured around the empty room. "It's so unnecessary. I was going to serve you next week. Clean and simple." There it was, the wound, delivered not with a blade, but with a sterile, procedural term. He said it as if he were revealing a kindness, a courtesy I had foolishly preempted. I looked at him, at this man I had loved, this man who saw the end of a decade of marriage as an administrative task. "You weren't going to serve me, Victor," I said, my voice level and calm. "You were going to ambush me." The correction landed. He flinched, a flicker of something real in his eyes. He had been so focused on his own script that he never considered how it would feel for the other actor. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he stammered, his composure finally cracking. This was the 5th stage, raw vulnerability. The project manager was gone, and in his place was a confused, frightened man. "Like what?" I asked. And then he delivered the most honest sentence of our entire marriage, the line that laid bare the rotten foundation of his love. "You weren't supposed to be ready before me." It wasn't about my happiness or his. It wasn't about love or its absence. It was about control. My readiness was not a sign of my strength. To him, it was a violation of his plan. I had taken away his final act of management. I had written my own ending. I let the silence sit for a moment, letting his words hang in the empty air between us. I could have screamed. I could have cried. I could have listed every one of his failures. Instead, I asked a simple, quiet question. "Ready for what, Victor?" I asked, my voice gentle now, almost sad. "Ready to be discarded?" He had no answer. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly open, seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time in years. Not as a hostess, not as a designer, not as an asset, but as a woman who had quietly, meticulously, and completely saved herself. My new apartment became my sanctuary. At just under 900 square feet, it was a fraction of the size of the brownstone, but it felt infinitely larger. It was a space designed entirely for me, by me. There were no client dinners to host, no husband's ego to furnish. Every object had a purpose, a story, a reason for being there that was entirely my own. The light, as I'd known it would be, was extraordinary. It filled the main room in the mornings, making the colors of the kilim rug I'd laid down feel vibrant and alive. I painted the walls a soft, warm white, a blank canvas for my new life. My books, which had been scattered throughout the brownstone, now lined a single tall bookshelf, a consolidated library of my own mind. My grandmother's silver, which Victor had allocated to himself in his spreadsheet, sat polished in a small chest, waiting not for a formal dinner party, but for a quiet Tuesday night meal with a friend. The vindication I felt wasn't triumphant or loud. It was a quiet, steady peace. It was the joy of making coffee in my own small kitchen, of sitting on my velvet sofa with my feet up, of hearing nothing but the rustle of the hydrangeas outside my window. I had spent years designing a life around a man who saw it as a temporary showcase. Now, I was curating a life for myself, and the process was a form of healing. My work transformed as well. Freed from the pressure of maintaining the grand stage of our old life, my design aesthetic became more personal, more soulful. I took on smaller projects, clients who wanted homes that felt like them, not like a magazine spread. My portfolio, once filled with vast, impressive spaces, began to feature cozy, intelligent designs that prioritized comfort and character over square footage. One of my new clients, a writer who had just bought her first condo, saw photos of my own apartment and hired me on the spot. "I want to feel the way your home looks," she told me, "like it knows itself." My business began to thrive, not because I was chasing bigger contracts, but because I was finally doing work that was honest. I was no longer building beautiful cages. I was creating spaces for people to be free. The money I made, my pocket money, was enough. It was more than enough. It was the foundation of a life that was structurally sound because I had built it, beam by beam myself. My success wasn't revenge. It was the natural, inevitable consequence of removing the one thing that had been blocking the light. Our final encounter took place 9 months later in a sterile conference room at a lawyer's office in the Loop. We were there to sign the last of the divorce papers. I had arrived early, and I was looking out the window at the bustling city below when he walked in. I hadn't seen him since that day in the empty house. He looked diminished. The expensive suit he wore seemed to hang on him, a size too big. The confident posture I knew so well had been replaced by a subtle slump in his shoulders. He was living alone in the brownstone, a fact our lawyers had confirmed. He hadn't changed a thing. He was rattling around in my ghost, sleeping in a bedroom with no furniture save for the bed, eating takeout at the vast marble island in the kitchen. The house had become his mausoleum. He sat down opposite me at the long, polished table. For a few moments we were silent. The only sound was the rustle of papers as our lawyers prepared the documents. "You look good, Renee," he said finally. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, stated with a kind of weary surprise. "I am good, Victor," I replied, and I was. He sighed, a long, shallow breath. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. "I still don't understand why you did it that way. The secrecy, the drama." He was still clinging to his narrative, the one where he was the victim of my irrational behavior. I felt a wave of pity for him so profound it was almost painful. He would never understand, because understanding would require him to dismantle the very core of his identity, the man in control. I decided to give him a small gift, a piece of the truth he might, one day, be able to comprehend. "There was no drama, Victor," I said quietly. "There was only a decision. You made yours, I made mine. The only difference is, I didn't need an audience." He nodded slowly, the words sinking in. The lawyers placed the papers in front of us. We signed, our pens scratching against the heavy paper in the quiet room. It was over. As we stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "I guess I lost you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was an attempt at a final romantic tragedy, a story he could tell himself. I looked at him. This man who was now a stranger, a former client whose project was long since completed. And I offered him one last, gentle correction. "You didn't lose me, Victor," I said. "You misplaced me." For years, I believed love was an act of construction. You found a good foundation, you built strong walls, and you filled the space with beautiful things. You curated it, maintained it, and presented it to the world as a finished product. I thought the goal was to create something so perfect, so well designed, that it could withstand anything. But a home is not a fortress, and love is not a project to be managed. A house is just a structure. It's the life inside, the messy, unpredictable, unplannable moments that make it a home. It's the morning sunlight you didn't expect, the coffee spilled on the rug, the laughter that echoes in the hallway for no reason. It's the willingness to be vulnerable to the chaos of another person's heart. Victor was so busy trying to control the outcome, to manage the asset, that he forgot to live inside of it. He built a beautiful empty museum and was surprised when the curator decided to leave. I now understand that the most important space we ever design is the one within ourselves. It doesn't need to be grand. It doesn't need to impress anyone. It just needs to be honest. It needs good light, a comfortable place to sit, and a solid door you can lock when you need to be alone. It needs to be a place where you can breathe. My vindication was not in his loss, but in my own quiet gain. I didn't win. I just came home. I live in a small space now, but my world has never felt bigger. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.